Hello, very beautiful community. I wanted to say a few important things that might help ground us as we witness Trump's authoritarian revolution, a kind of authoritarian consolidation against the background of there still being a lot of pluralistic political competition in the United States. So let's talk about this. Politics is very roughly when human relationships mediated by institutions human beings share transcend a state of war. Politics implies a certain degree of acceptance between political opponents of shared procedures that apply to everybody. And we have a crisis in the West, we have a crisis in particular in the United States about accepting shared procedure. We have had a breakdown of the capacity of most major political actors to say, whatever we disagree about, we have a protective disposition, we feel sacredly about the rules of the game. What we've got in the United States is an administration that wants to break the rules of the game. So that's politics. And so what's most special about politics is the very thing that people are losing commitment to. And when you lose a commitment to that thing, and when you lose that thing, politics at least partly lapses into a state of war of all against all. And when we think about what the state is for, we should always start with Thomas Hobbes, who fundamentally understood what the modern state was all about, because the modern state for Hobbes is about avoiding extreme kinds of breakdown of order. And if you can guarantee order, then you can guarantee other things. It's the political thing you need to guarantee before anything else politically becomes possible. However, what we have, to our benefit, learned in recent decades and in a century or more is that when the historical winds blow in the right direction, we can get a lot better than just order. We can get a situation where we're aspiring to include all citizens in the fruits of society. We also aspire to bring it about that we're at least in principle committed to helping all citizens when they run into contingent kinds of misfortune that are not their fault. And that's roughly the story of the development of the modern welfare state over the last half century and more. That too, funnily enough, needs a very considerable degree of trust. So what we're talking about at the level of what the state is for is a lapse from a more ambitious to a less ambitious answer to the question of what the state can do. The wave of post-truth authoritarians all over the West is going to take us toward a more pessimistic, a more minimal conception of what the state does. Now, before we get to actual points, one last broad brushstroke. You would know that I have categorized Trumpism as an ideology that is centrally monarchist, with a strong element of hyper-neoliberalism, might is right, and significant scores, perhaps medium scores, on fascism traits. So that, however, is what I would call the truth about the nature of Trumpism. It's not necessarily the best political thing to say about Trumpism when you're engaged in political debate and political competition. It's a better thing to say in a history seminar. So if we are in a history seminar and we raise the question, is Trumpism fascist? And you forced me into a yes or no answer, my answer would be no. Even though, strictly speaking, the answer is yes, because fascism has very significant fascist traits. Trumpism has very significant fascist traits. However, it is so much more a kind of monarchist ideology that I'd be forced into a very reluctant no, if you had to ask it just blank. Obviously, if you asked me, is fascism a significant ideological element in Trumpism, the answer would be clearly yes. Then, on top of this history seminar definition of fascism, there are then simpler kinds of definitions of fascism, and they're to do with things like, are people being taken away in the middle of the night, and if so, in what number? And when people are being taken away in the middle of the night in significant numbers, you can say you've crossed into the F trajectory. And so by that much more tight political standard, we would say that Hungary is not fascist, but Belarus is. But what I wanted to share today were just 2 or 3 points that help us think better about how to live through this authoritarian consolidation. Here's one thought I wanted to share with you today. There is something very depoliticizing about Trumpism. Namely, it depoliticizes, it disables its political opponents by making its political opponents feel that it's not quite real, that it's a television show, an annoying television show, perhaps a television show you can't switch off, but a television show, and so you don't need to do anything about it. And that's a very dangerous expression of neoliberalism in Trumpism, because it creates the boiling frog effect for the political opponents of that political project. It depoliticizes you by persuading you that authoritarian politics that's working against you is actually a form of yucky entertainment. And notice how many people relate to it like that, like a kind of nightmarish TV show you can't turn off, rather than to politics, with which you need to engage, and where you need to, mobilize yourself to become a citizen who's able to engage in conflict constructively. Now, at this point, you might ask a related question, and this is not so much a point as just a footnote, and that's, when's the political system going to get activated? Like, where is Congress? Where are the significant challenges that are meant to see against Trumpism, if there really is this authoritarian consolidation taking place? Well, you see a few here and there. Too many of them are just at a local level. But fundamentally, what you need to understand is that politicians will not act against authoritarianism until it's clear enough to them that acting against authoritarianism will serve their career rather than undermining it. At the moment, too many people in power in the United States fear that certain kinds of very direct action against Trump, very direct positioning against Trump, it's just going to undermine their career. And if that's what you think, you're going to persuade yourself that not undermining your own career is good for the country anyway. So what you want, and you're going to have moments of it, where there is a kind of, if you like, convergence between doing the right thing to challenge authoritarian consolidation and advancing your career. When that overlaps, you're actually going to see more action. The other point I wanted to make is about the deceptive revolutionary nature of Trumpism. If you look at Trump's supporters on social media, they will typically be anti-woke. Well, I am non-woke. But they're not really anti-woke. They're actually anti something that's more essential to our democracy than a particular kind of fad, a particular kind of unconstructive mode of pursuing social justice, which we've had just perhaps in the last decade, which was all about taking political conflict and making it moral, taking moral conflict, making it about identity, and taking identity conflict and wanting institutions to entrench it, which is just a very unconstructive way, to put it mildly, of doing politics in a conflictive society. Because if you try to do politics that way, you're trying to win in political conflict by making the case that the political conflict shouldn't be there. Well, if that's how you do it, you're going to lose. And it's not a surprise that woke political movements have coincided with a very strong victory for authoritarianism. But the anti-wokeism of Trumpism is deceptive. What Trumpism is really against is two things. It's against the inclusion revolution of the 1960s, and Michael Ignatieff likes to emphasize this point. And that inclusion revolution has nothing to do with wokeism, because advancing the rights of important minority groups in the United States has got nothing to do with wokeism. It's just healthy social justice. So don't give us the bullshit that you're anti-woke. You're actually exclusionary, right? Because the correct objection to wokeism is there's a more constructive way of including structurally disadvantaged groups in that kind of politics. But the Trumpist position is let's exclude structurally disadvantaged groups. That's one thing Trumpism is against. The other thing it's against is roughly the economy of counter-majoritarian institutions, the economy of checks and balances on political power. So that's where we are. There's plenty more to say. There's plenty of economic remarks to make, because all of these Western countries are facing very, very difficult economic challenges. And the two ways out of them are not really very workable. One's to raise taxation, the other is to shrink the welfare state. Well, both actually are either electorally counterproductive or undermine trust. So we're in a very thorny economic problem, not everywhere in the West. And we're also facing a problem of democratic incapacity in a different sense to the one I typically talk about. When I use the word democratic incapacity, I typically mean democratic decline. That's to say, loss of trust in institutions, loss of trust in the political process as a result of particular social forces such as social media, economic exclusion, the untethering of social bonds, ideologies of a very individualistic kind of self-realization, and so on. But what I mean in this instance by democratic incapacity is that when you're in a crisis, you've got to be able to do something about it quite quickly. But our democracies are not set up to do anything quickly about anything, unless it is an ultimate emergency, like a state of war or some kind of existential event that endangers your country or the earth. And so we need to act quickly, but our systems are built to not be able to do anything quickly at all. Final remark about hope and optimism. Hope is not something you can choose to have, but I'm incredibly hopeful about the future. And indeed, I'm also optimistic about the future, but my optimism is relative to the understanding that we have to consider the whole of the human past and not just the recent past. If we consider the recent past, then we're going to find what we're going through extraordinarily turbulent and difficult to fathom. If we look at the whole past, we're going to find what we're going through as the beginning of a challenging historical phase that's challenging on a kind of low to medium level in historical terms. Now, the practical question there is, how far can Trump's authoritarian consolidation go? How far will somebody who's a successor of Trump in the 2030s be able to go? And what will be the equivalent of this in other Western countries? How many of us are going to lose our democracies? How many of us are going to keep our democracies? And what I want to say is that we have to be double-minded here. On the one hand, we have to be very empathetic with citizens who are paralyzed by the prospect of losing their democracy, even if they're unlikely to. Just the very idea that they have a chance of losing their democracy is paralyzing for citizens. But on the other hand, we also have to realize that there's a way of being politically adult, which means that if you've got a 1% chance of success, you have to act. And our chance of success is not 1% if success is keeping our democracies. Our chance of success is about 50-50. So we should absolutely not feel dejected or resigned about where we're going at the level of this crucial practical question of whether we're actually going to keep a sufficiently pluralistic political system that we can call democracy, or whether we're going to experience an asphyxiation of counter-majoritarian institutions and no longer live under democracy, wake up not living under democracy. We don't know what the chances are of the United States losing its democracy. I think 50-50 is a reasonable guess. If you pushed me hard against the wall, I'd probably say it's 70-30 in the negative, right? So it's a 70% chance that the United States will lose its democracy by the middle of this century. But you can still get it back. I mean, look at Hungary. Orban has ended democracy there. In other words, that's a reasonable thing to say about Hungary, but at the same time, Orban is experiencing the biggest challenge of his career in power as we speak. So there is room for reversal, but there's also plenty of room to stop this thing. So I'll give you a very clear example. If there were in the United States a Democrat project which centered economic democratization, which gave up on and apologized for technocratic solutions to problems which deeply divide the country, and went beyond what I call, the dying politics of centrist technocracy. If they were populist but pro-institutional communication, if there was some project of political reform that went together with the enterprise of civic renewal, then the chances of the US losing its democracy would be about 20%. Is such a project likely or not? Well, we can say that it's probably unlikely, but it's more than possible. It's entirely doable. So, it's not just that there is a good chance of success. It's that you can put the odds back in your favor by taking action, as long as you understand that collectively enough, a single individual can't make a difference. That just swings the country one way or the other. But they can make a very small difference, nevertheless, that combined with other small differences made by other people can make all the difference in the world, right? That might just mean, at some point, I don't know, being peacefully on the streets. So it's very important that there is hope, And it's very important that your history is not going to be just something that happens to you. You're going to be able to participate in it. And together with other citizens, you will be, in a position to inflect where your country goes. So fatalism is wrong, and corrosive pessimism is wrong, and hopelessness is wrong. Because there's a modicum of, good prospect around the chances that things will work out well. There is also a modicum of space for action, effective action. And, of course, fatalism and hopelessness are self-perpetuating. So the more hopeless you are, the more hopeless you get. So these are my 2.5 cents of grounding thoughts for tonight. Lots and lots of love.